I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Today, I have with me Chris Lindsey, who is the Director of State Advocacy and Public Policy for the American Trade Association of Cannabis and Hemp. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks very much for having me here, Hillary.
Okay. Now, I've known you for a long time, probably 10 years plus, and definitely known of you. And to me, in the beginning, you're quite legendary. But I'd like you, if you can, to tell our listeners about your background in the cannabis industry.
Sure. Well, yeah, it goes back a little ways, not as far back as some I know, but I've been at this probably, I guess you'd say, since 2006. It really starts for me where I was a trial lawyer, just doing criminal law, and had people started coming into my office saying, hey, I got in trouble for possession, but I'm actually a medical marijuana patient. And I was like, really? Medical marijuana? That's actually a thing. And and so started just to kind of get a little familiar with it. And it actually wasn't very long after that I actually was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And I ended up in the hospital. This was pretty early. Crohn's is sort of better known now as a disease. At this time, it wasn't as well known. And I was in and out of the hospital for months. Eventually, I just was straight up hospitalized. And at one point, they just ran out of things to try. So I got life flighted to another hospital in another state. And eventually they came around and they said, okay, we think we know the situation. You have Crohn's. But the reason why we have been confused about this is you're 36 years old. And people who get this disease usually are in their teens or early 20s. And so it just never added up for us. But you mentioned, and I did mention when I got admitted that, yeah, I'm a regular marijuana consumer. By the time I was at that point, I wasn't holding back. And so I thought, they're not going to come in and arrest me or anything like that. I wanted them to know what I was up to. And yeah, regular consumer. And the doctor said, we think you've actually probably had Crohn's since then. You have just been managing your disease and not realizing it. And it was absolutely the case that I had backed off and decided I just didn't want to consume as much. And that was when I started to get a lot more, sick. And so that was pretty eye-opening, for me. Was like, well, there you have it. There really is such a thing as medical marijuana right up in your face. And so I got out of the hospital and literally had to start walking again because I had atrophied and all the stuff. And went back to the treatment team and said, okay, I need to get my medical marijuana card. And none of them would sign my form from the state. And they said because we would get in trouble, the DEA. And it was pretty early for me in all this. I didn't understand totally how all the dots connected, but it was clearly this was just bullshit because they told me that I had been self-medicating, if anything. And yes, I should be participating, all the things they said, but they wouldn't sign the form. So that was the point where I said, okay, something has to happen. So I started testifying up at the Capitol and meeting great people who also sort of shared this passion and this conviction that, look, this is a real thing here. We got to do this better because this is stupid the way it's working right now. I had to literally drive for 4 hours in Montana just to find a doctor close enough that was willing to sign my form. And I uncategorically had the disease, and the disease was clearly listed in the state deal. It wasn't like this was, pushing any envelopes here. So that's what set me off, met the folks, and eventually thought, you know what, after a couple of legislative sessions in Montana, we said we could probably take a swing at this as a business. We could do this seriously. This wouldn't be a basement operation. We'd pay our taxes and do all the things, So we got an accounting firm, we got bank accounts, we got set up, Montana Cannabis. It grew real fast. This was at the time when Obama was just campaigning to get into office the first time. And so he started throwing out there stuff that became super important to us later, which was, yeah, I don't think the federal government needs to put resources to enforcing this if they're following state law. Well, that was the gospel to us. It was like, okay, if we can identify a way to work within the state system, then this should work. And we're not going to be, worried about federal law enforcement. And so that's what we did, and it took off. We got to meet great people. I learned so much, but living in the greenhouse, living the life and doing hard work. And after about a year, I was just like, it took a real toll on me physically. Of course, I was still dealing with Crohn's and all the rest. And so it just made more sense for me to say, I'm just going to go back and be a lawyer. And so moved from the business to practicing law. I was sort of the first marijuana lawyer in Montana that wasn't just doing criminal law. And there were plenty of good lawyers doing that. But I was more of the new generation. Hey, this is medical marijuana, and I want to represent people who get sort of abused by the law or whatnot. So working with businesses and working with the patients and, good times. I was always a little worried about the phone ringing. I'll tell you that, because it was dicey. Like law enforcement was fully in. Like this, not like today. All you kids today, you don't know, but it was rough because totally you'd have, random law enforcement just, and still happens, by the way, in a place like Michigan, where you just all of a sudden people get busted. At any rate, year and a half goes by. Suddenly the DEA shows up in state. They raid 28 businesses in about 2.5 hours, and including the one that I had helped set up, Montana Cannabis. So at that point, it's a big question about, lots and lots of people get arrested. Businesses, of course, shut down overnight. The whole thing just kind of goes, the whole industry in the state went into deep freeze, or at least underground. And I ended up getting charged as a co-conspirator because under the federal system, this obviously, under the federal system, once you are participating in something they consider a criminal enterprise, you're in it, like you're part of it until basically you have to jump through many hoops that are hard to jump through in order to really just say, I don't have anything to do with it anymore. And it was a weird situation because I actually still represented that company. Like I was fully on board with what they did. It's not like we did a conspiracy to rob a bank and at a certain point I bailed on that conspiracy. It was more like, no, it was a full business endeavor. And yeah, we made massive amounts of marijuana, and sure, I sold it. I drove it around the state and gave it to people repeatedly. None of that was in question. And I didn't feel bad about any of that stuff. And so even though I wasn't in the business anymore, I was still very much considered part of the gang. And so I got charged with a ridiculous number of charges. It was silly. It was like 7 charges, but they have, at the federal system, you have mandatory minimums. And just adding up the mandatory minimum years, it came to like over 400 years in federal prison. Mandatory minimum, right? And this isn't like murdering babies. Like this isn't the worst thing you can imagine. This is literally medical marijuana business operating under state law, out in the open. We literally had state law enforcement visit our place in order to train law enforcement. Like they weren't there to like give us a ton. We trained the drug task force. Well, we didn't train them. They came to our place as part of their training, and we'd walk them around, show them stuff. Some of those dudes got deputized by the DEA, were in on the raids. It was like it all changed. Of course, then there's the whole trial and everything else. And through absolute blind luck, God's mercy, wherever you are on the spectrum, I got some favors because of and believe me, I got more of the story. I can leave it there just to say Once I got on the other side of that, there was no path for me but advocacy. It was, this system is so messed up that I could do what I did for the reasons that we did and the help that I know we gave to people, and yet being portrayed as this like literally drug kingpin kind of situation where we couldn't use the word medical in the trial. Like it just all that stuff was so nonsensical to me that was the only path that I could see. And so started working for Marijuana Policy Project. And that how I got in. I'm sorry, you asked a real simple question, but that was a story.
You nailed the answer, because this is why among us early movers, you were legendary, because you're maybe the only attorney who was not engaged in nefarious conduct, because some lawyers are, right, in aiding and abetting real cartel activity, etc. You were trying to follow Montana state laws and you got dinged by the feds. And this is like every lawyer's nightmare that was practicing in the space and assisting these businesses. And, frankly, we're not out of the woods yet with the current status of federal law. Even though they appear to be inactive, they are not. And when the eye of Sauron turns, it turns really hard. And I remember thinking at the time, Montana is so crazy to me politically, because it's not like the state and the locals probably didn't help the DEA and the feds. There's kind of a partnership there. And I always perceived Montana as more libertarian. So to see something like that occur, it kind of shocks the conscience a little bit. And I was on the West Coast. Obviously, we have U.S. attorney generals as well. And we had two that were kind of warring with each other, depending on what side of the mountains they were on in the state of Washington. And I remember hearing of your story, and I just thought, that is the ultimate. And yet you live to tell the tale. And now you're on the advocacy side, which is great, because what I really want to get into is what eventually led you into the American Trade Association of Cannabis and Hemp, because a lot of these cannabis trade organizations have risen and fallen. It's very hard to get consensus of one uniform, reasonable voice in cannabis. There's a lot of inside baseball and kind of attacking each other and different initiatives, and it's a little fractured. So what led you to, and I'm going to say it, but you can correct me, ATACH? Which one is it?
We go with ATACH.
ATACH. Okay.
Some in the synthetic THC industry will call us ATAC, and I'm okay with that. So we'll get to that in a minute. So I will tell you, how did I get sort of from I'm on probation, and kind of my advocacy as in terms of a lawyer, that's had to wish all my clients well, and they had to find other representation. I started working for MPP, so there's the state by state by state, and I worked in many. I had the very, very good fortune of working for Karen O'Keefe, who's just she is the unsung hero, I think, of advocacy that has trained so many people, and everything I learned from her. So got to work for her for almost 10 years, and kind of whipped me into shape. I actually thought I was doing okay before I worked for MPP. It turns out I wasn't. But anyway, so about in those early days, the funds that kept the organization coming were coming largely from philanthropy dollars. And these were often driven by individuals who sort of saw that the criminal justice system in the United States has got big problems, and there's no better single example of this in terms of overall harm than the war on drugs. There's no single better example within the war on drugs than marijuana. And so if we can undermine that or end it or legalize or whatever we can do to end this kind of abuse of the criminal justice system by using marijuana to sort of intrude in so far into people's lives, that's a good thing. And so those sorts of broad efforts were what would get checks written to Marijuana Policy Project and others, Drug Policy Alliance and others that were kind of running around the time. Well, that's all well and good until you get to about the mid-teens. So around 2016, 2017, and probably a little bit earlier than that, it's like now you're starting to see like true dollars coming in from these state programs that are now starting to stand up as a result of the changes in laws that these organizations are seeing. And if you're writing the checks from the philanthropists, you're saying, well, I'm reading headlines about billions of dollars now being brought in. Maybe you should go talk to some of those people if you need money. And so that was a real serious problem because it meant that now you had to, frankly, start thinking about what does it mean for us to go raise money from businesses, because that's different. Now they have an agenda. Now they might want to participate in what you're talking about. And so we're no longer just sort of pie in the sky, this needs to end because of the things. We're now on agendas, and that's a different world. And so the reality is that you don't do advocacy in this space if you don't have companies that you work with that believe in what you do, that transition. And so I started working for one called U.S. Cannabis Council, helped launch it and did the GR, the government relations parts. So met with members of Congress and we did all kinds of stuff and had goals and all the things that you do when you're doing the lobbying work. So suddenly it's just kind of DC stuff, and did that for a while, which was super exciting, but found that my current employer is really focused on a couple of key issues that I became very interested in. And so it made a lot of sense for me just really to make a transition. And it's about two things. One is, how do we deal with properly, in a smart way, in a sensible way, the emergence of hemp intoxicants into this whole mix? It was complicated enough. Now here comes this, right? And I've always been pro-legalization. That hasn't changed. But the landscape is way more complicated now. And the other thing is descheduling or rescheduling and trying to see that through. And ATACH has really been very effective in both of those areas. And so I'm super excited to be kind of in a place where I can do the advocacy and have the luxury of being able to do it in areas that I feel real passionate about.
And so, let's dive into those two things, because those are the two big ticket items for 2025 and beyond. I mean, let's be honest. What is ATACH's current position on cannabis? Rescheduling, legalization, something in between?
You can be sure that we're all in on descheduling. I mean, that's the only long-term solution, is treat it like conceptually, big picture conceptually, like alcohol, treat it like tobacco. Probably don't really want to be treated like tobacco. I'm just saying that we need to have a system that is kind of bespoke. It's designed for this substance. It's got enough little gotchas and, little twists and turns and how it has to be dealt with. You probably have to have something designed for it. Now, that's not been on the menu in any practical way at the federal level. There are plenty of proposals. Proposals are as easy as writing a check in DC. So the fact that there are a lot of different proposals for legalization means that, hey, money changed hands. And I don't want to be so crude. It's obviously a lot more than that, but moving this issue along through the whole song that we got in Schoolhouse Rock, we're very much on the front end of that song in terms of how we move towards legalization through Congress. So suffice it to say that while we are very supportive of descheduling, getting to a sort of legalization framework where you would deschedule and have a regulatory system around that, we are very far. What the Biden administration did was introduce this idea of rescheduling. And so that's important, and it would do some very helpful things for people, especially those that are in business. But again, that's where a lot of this stuff happens. They would get some huge benefits. And the biggest one is that they would really just be treated like other businesses in the United States rather than criminal enterprises. So that's kind of a big deal. But that's about the only gimme you get by moving from 1 to 3. So I'm still very supportive of that and work towards that. But we don't really have legalization until we get, to descheduling, moving it completely out of the Controlled Substances Act. And unfortunately, that's going to be a wait.
Yeah, that is also my understanding. And I'm not even doing anything on the Hill, right? But this is why we have you on today, because I want to talk about what you're hearing on the Hill and what you're advocating for relative to intoxicating hemp. Because what I'm seeing in the marketplace is that these state licensed cannabis companies are kind of caving and saying, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's start an intoxicating hemp line. And then others that are dying on the Hill and saying never and advocating for bans. So what are you seeing out there on that this year in 2025?
Right. Well, I think that there's a bit of a narrative that has developed and gotten a little, the flames have been fanned around this idea that it's marijuana versus hemp. And I think that that's definitely a misnomer. I think that where we're at now is we have a broad range of regulatory frameworks, and some of them are effective and others are less so. Some of them are way overregulated, and some virtually don't have any regulations at all. We have to really approach these things with a health and safety framework. That's the only difference that regulated businesses can really go to Congress with or to state lawmakers with, because nobody's really having trouble getting marijuana these days, right? You don't have people out in the streets saying, I demand access. Everybody's got access. It's a matter of where you're making your choices, right? And if you're from government, there's really only two things you probably care about. One is, are we getting any revenue for any of this? And two is, are these products reasonably safe? And to me, it's that safety component that is really the value add, if you will, of our entire endeavor. To say that, oh, we're better off with a regulatory system and this and that, it's really to say that our products are better, right? That that we hit certain marks, that you're not going to be consuming bad things with your product. And so that's kind of where we focus, that there's Tennessee, right? They have a hemp program. We're going to call it hemp in Tennessee. We all know it's marijuana. We're going to call it medical cannabis in a medical cannabis only state. We're going to call it adult use in Illinois, where, but they all have frameworks that bear very similar policies for very similar reasons. And I think that we need to take a step back, because to your point, there are a lot of those marijuana companies right now that are having to make strategic choices. Am I supposed to tell them that, oh, no, wait a minute, you have to keep paying 280E and you have to keep hitting a bar so high that you may or may not make it this next year just because you did everything the state asked you to do in their marijuana program? And definitely don't avail yourself of the new programs that are developing around the country around these. That's not my place to say. What I care about is that we don't undermine what progress has been made, right? And let me just explain what I mean by that. So Montana was bumping along with a medical marijuana program, and it was popular. You would ask your Joe on the street what they think about medical marijuana, and they'd probably say, you know what, I think it's a good idea if it helps people. And if you're an industry selling marijuana for a living, that's exactly where you want to be. But the problem is that in a poorly regulated environment, you have a situation where you become judged by your worst actors. And suddenly you're driving into school in Billings, Montana, passing a billboard that talks about the cheapest ounce you can buy in the state, right? And you're hearing from law enforcement that's saying, oh my God, now there's cartels here and we're an export state. People are shipping Montana bud to Idaho now. That's where we're seeing that. Like, that's how the headlines changed. And it was not long after that before law enforcement started to show up. And that's the concern that I have. And so we have regulatory programs for marijuana. They are over regulated. That's what happens when you ask lawmakers to legalize something that they have been trained to hate, right? They're going to over-regulate it. So then here comes hemp, which is under-regulated. And part of me is like, go for it. I mean, who am I to all of a sudden put up roadblocks? But the fact of the matter is that in over a dozen states, there have been legal challenges to states trying to put regulatory systems into place. Like the hemp folks would say, well, we don't want to do X or Y or Z. And they would just go into federal court and say, you can't touch me, I'm the gingerbread man. You are preempted by federal law. It shows up in the Farm Bill. You can't tell me I can't sell this. And oh, and by the way, I do want to be regulated. And by regulated, I mean, 21 or older. And, let's start with that. And it's like, look, from my perspective, that's madness because it's just a matter of time before that pendulum will swing right back. And you think the public won't figure out what's been going on? Like, really? You're just going to continue to crank out massive amounts of high potency drugs in candy form and ship them across state lines to kids in other states, and that's not going to be a problem for anybody. And so my sort of jumping off point in all of this is that you have to have some kind of regulatory system or we're screwed. Like, the federal government has not changed its laws at all. And they start seeing kids on a massive scale getting addicted or going to the hospital or whatever the horrible things are that the haters are going to seize upon. And you think there's any protection for any of these companies? There's no reason why the government can't flip that switch and just start busting again. And look, and if it gets to that point, we've lost. I mean, forget about who goes to jail. It's the fact that we will have lost the public. And suddenly this is all just a sham. And why did we ever do any of this in the first place? And suddenly all the work to get natural marijuana products out there and licensed and at least available is undermined by people synthesizing designer THC in their basement. Like, I'm not going to lose on that. That's ridiculous. I'm not losing on that bullshit. So anyway, sorry.
In your opinion, then, do you think that Congress is going to address this kind of infamous quote unquote loophole in the Farm Bill that permits for these intoxicating cannabinoids? We know that they have through the end of the year on this version of the Farm Bill hailing from 2018. Do you think they're aching to close it / address it? How aware do you think they really are?
They definitely want to close it. Here's my prediction. Understand that all this happened in the context of the Farm Bill and understand who's involved in passing things like the Farm Bill. These are members of Congress who are agriculture in their orient. They're not criminal rights crusaders. They're not civil rights warriors. Some of them may want to legalize, but the Agriculture Act is not the place for it. And they very much feel like they were lied to in 2018 about what was going to happen. You go back into the record and it was over and over and over again. This was rope, not dope. And nobody is talking about rope today. Nobody. Everybody is talking about how much money they've made and how much money they're not going to make if this loophole closes. And to a member of Congress, that's like you just sealed the deal. They are so uninterested in keeping people who have taken advantage of the law they thought they were passing and just turned it into exactly what they were trying to avoid. That's offensive to those members. And so they have zero interest in this argument that, hey, people love it. We should be able to continue to sell it. Why can't you just keep it open, right? So believe me, members of Congress want to see that loophole or, whatever you want to call it. The question is about regular order, which is how do bills move through Congress? And we can see that even in a no-brainer like the Farm Bill, which has to pass every 5 years because farming, I mean, $1 trillion farming, not the little teeny weeny corner of a corner called hemp, right? That can't move. We're dealing with issues way beyond our ability to control. So we're in the Farm Bill, but we were in the Farm Bill, I guess, because there's going to be a new Farm Bill. I don't see any of the leadership changing their opinions. I think Republicans understand now at the federal level what's been going on. So I do think that members are intent in closing that. But I want to say this is very important. I also think that there is a pathway to do what really should have happened at the outset, which is to create that system that accounts for these products. And it can, if nothing else, what it should do is allow states the freedom to do all of the things they need to do, right? Because again, we run into problems. Banks still have problems underwriting hemp companies. There are still questions about tax liability. We're still dealing with a redheaded stepchild problem with no clear regulatory authority and uncertainty, right? So we need that addressed. To the FDA, these products all along have technically been illegal because they don't meet standards for health and safety. Well, come on, let's address that. And look, if we're dealing with an upsurge in interest because we got a whole bunch of new energy and new companies in that direction, then come on, this is the time. Let's go to DC with the right solution. Stop jerry-rigging the farm bill. I can't imagine a whole industry that has to get reauthorized every 5 years, which is what would have to happen. Forget that. Come up with a better solution. That's where we should be. And look, we're already in the world where this stuff is moving around. We don't have to ask permission. We're asking for a better approach to what's happening already.
And final question for you while I have you, given that part of your title is state advocacy. What do you think the states are going to do about this year? Because it seems like we're heading towards just this spectrum of splits on what can be done. California bans any amount of intoxicating hemp and consumer products. And then you've got Minnesota, total contrast, that embraced it, is quasi-regulating it, and you can get THC beverages with hemp at a bar.
Yeah, there's going to be a wide range of possible frameworks, and I think that there are good versions of all of these. I think there are pitfalls in these that we just need to be able to identify and work with policymakers to say, here's a thing you need to be aware of. So I do think that no matter what happens at the federal level, this is always going to come down to what are states going to do. And the problem that we were addressing as an organization was the very real sort of existential threat of going into federal court and claiming states don't have any authority over these products. Because if you think about where that goes, that destroys the state regulated system completely. Because who in their right mind would run a state licensed marijuana company if you can call yourself hemp and pay no taxes and have no regulation, right? And so that was a real serious problem. And so now that it's sort of clear, the Fourth Circuit recently sort of, in my estimation, was kind of the final nail in the coffin of this issue, that states very clearly are not preempted. They have the authority to regulate these products. So issue is sort of been resolved in a lot of ways to me. Congress can continue to do Congress. We're going to be focused now on the states. So I have been involved myself supporting our members in Arizona, Missouri, Illinois, Florida, Ohio, and New Jersey. We're expanding as an organization now to bring in more states into the conversation, because we're not here trying to say the hemp guys are going to lose, the marijuana guys are going to win. We're here to say, look at the system that you have. How do we make that the best system that we can make it? Because if we have bad actors running away with this stuff, it undermines everything that we've been working towards. And I think people that are in the industry understand that. We have to be able to manage what we've got. And that's what I aim to do. And I know that's what ATACH aims to do.
All right. Well, thanks for all the input. I hope these states can find harmonious regulatory structures that don't embrace prohibition. We all know it doesn't work anyway. And I want to thank you, Chris, for coming on to the Cannabis Law Now podcast. And I wish you all the best at ATACH and its governmental relation efforts.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me on and letting me go on about all this stuff.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.